May 19th. 1942 arrived with bitter news crackling through military telegraph lines across Washington. And Admiral Ernest King slammed his fist on the mahogany desk hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. The Allied forces had suffered catastrophic losses in the Pacific, and conventional warfare was bleeding America dry. Japanese forces controlled vast territories, their defenses growing more formidable with each passing day. The Navy needed something radical, something the enemy would never see coming, something that broke every rule in the military handbook. In a smoke-filled conference room at the Navy Department building, a plan emerged that would have been laughed out of consideration just months earlier. Lieutenant Commander Philip Bucklew stood before a panel of skeptical admirals, proposing the unthinkable: recruit men whom the traditional military had rejected, train them in guerrilla tactics, and insert them behind enemy lines to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations. These would not be the polished officers from Annapolis or the parade ground perfect sailors. These would be brawlers, rebels, swimmers, and misfitsmen who could think independently and survive where conventional units would perish. The Japanese military presence in the Pacific had swelled to terrifying numbers. Intelligence reports estimated 30,000 enemy troops fortifying key positions across the Solomon Islands alone. Traditional amphibious assaults had proven devastatingly costly. At Tarawa, which would come later, the Marines would wade through chest-deep water into withering machine gun fire because nobody had properly scouted the reef barriers. The Navy could not afford another massacre. Bucklew's proposal drew from lessons learned during the British commando raids in Europe. He had witnessed firsthand how small, highly trained units could accomplish what entire battalions could not, but America needed its own breed of maritime warriors, men who could operate in the water as naturally as on land, who could navigate by stars, who could kill silently with knives or bare hands, who could swim for miles in hostile waters carrying explosives. According to declassified Naval Historical Center documents from this period, the initial recruitment orders went out with deliberately vague language. The Navy sought volunteers for prolonged, dangerous, and special duty. The officers doing the recruiting visited brigs, disciplinary barracks, and units where troublemakers had been shuffled aside. They wanted men with certain characteristics: exceptional swimmers, those with navigation skills, individuals with arrest records for bar fights rather than serious crimes, sailors who had punched their commanding officers for good reason, men who questioned orders when those orders made no tactical sense. The term criminals was an exaggeration, though not entirely inaccurate. Many of these first volunteers had disciplinary records. Some faced courts-martial for insubordination. Others had been branded as attitude problems. Men who refused to shine their shoes to regulation standards, or who spoke their minds when silence would have better served their careers. The traditional military structure had no place for such individuals. But war has a way of revealing that sometimes the misfits possess exactly the qualities needed for impossible missions. By June of 1942, approximately 40 men had been selected for what would become the Scouts and Raiders program. They gathered at the amphibious training base in Little Creek, Virginia. Having no idea they were about to undergo the most brutal military training program ever devised by American forces, most of them expected some kind of punishment detail. Instead, they found themselves at the birthplace of what would eventually evolve into the most elite fighting force in American military history. June 23, 1942, marked the beginning of training that would make grown men weep. And the instructors at Little Creek showed no mercy from the first moment boots hit sand. Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, fresh from evacuating General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines in a daring PT boat operation, had been brought in to help design the curriculum. His philosophy was brutally simple: break them completely, then rebuild them into something superhuman. The 40 volunteers quickly discovered why they had been chosen. The first exercise sent them into the fragile waters of Chesapeake Bay at 0300 hours, wearing full combat gear, ordered to swim 2 miles to a designated beach, locate and destroy a mock enemy installation, then swim back before dawn. 5 men quit before reaching the halfway point. The instructors pulled them from the water and sent them back to their regular units, without ceremony or shame. This program had no room for those who could not push beyond perceived limitations. Physical conditioning consumed 18 hours of every day. The men ran endless miles in boots filling with sand. They performed calisthenics until muscles screamed and refused to respond to commands from the brain. They learned hand-to-hand combat from instructors who had studied Kudokan Judo in Japan before the war. Men who could break bones with precise strikes and taught their students to do the same. The volunteers discovered that killing a man silently required technique, not just strength, the blade entering at the correct angle between ribs, a garrote applied with proper pressure to crush the windpipe without allowing a scream. Water training separated the exceptional from the merely competent. These men learned to swim for hours in cold water that induced hypothermia within minutes for the unprepared. They practiced underwater navigation, swimming beneath the surface for distances that seemed impossible, holding their breath until vision narrowed to pinpoints and lungs burned like they had been filled with acid. They learned to approach enemy vessels silently, attaching limpet mines to hulls while guards stood meters above, completely unaware of the danger lurking beneath the waterline. The demolitions training proved particularly dangerous, as referenced in Captain Robert Dawson's classified report to naval operations dated August 1942. The volunteers learned to work with composition explosives, calculating precisely how much TNT or the newer composition C materials were needed to destroy different types of targets. They practiced assembling charges while blindfolded, because missions might require preparing explosives in absolute darkness. 2 men lost fingers during training accidents, neither washed out. They learned to work with 9 fingers and continued. Navigation training emphasized celestial methods because these men would operate where compasses might be unavailable or unreliable. They memorized star patterns until they could determine their position within miles using only the night sky. They studied tide tables and current patterns, learning to read the ocean like scholars read ancient texts. They became students of weather, able to predict storms from cloud formations and barometric pressure changes. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to think independently. Unlike traditional military training that emphasized following orders without question, this program demanded initiative. The instructors presented scenarios where the original plan had failed, then asked, "What now?" The correct answer was never wait for orders. The correct answer involved assessing the situation, identifying alternatives, and taking decisive action. By September of 1942, only 23 of the original 40 remained. These survivors had been forged into something unprecedented in American military history. They could operate for days behind enemy lines without support. They could survive on minimal rations and contaminated water. They could navigate hostile territory using only natural landmarks. They could kill efficiently and without remorse when necessary. They were ready for deployment to the Pacific, though none of them truly understood the hell that awaited. October 7th. 1942 found the 23 graduates of the Scouts and Raiders program boarding a transport ship in San Diego Harbor, and the reality of their mission settled over them like a funeral shroud. Their destination was classified, but rumors spread through the ranks: Guadalcanal, where Marines were locked in a desperate struggle against overwhelming Japanese forces. The enemy controlled the sea approaches, making resupply dangerous and reconnaissance nearly impossible. The Scouts and Raiders would change that equation. Lieutenant Jack Taylor commanded the unit, a former Olympic swimmer from California whose easygoing demeanor masked a mind that processed tactical problems with computer-like precision. He gathered his men in the ship's hold during the second night at sea, spreading maps across a folding table, illuminated by a single hanging bulb that swayed with the vessel's movement. The maps showed the coastline of Guadalcanal's northern beaches, areas where Japanese forces had established bunkers, artillery positions, and supply depots. The mission parameters were straightforward but nearly suicidal. The team would insert by rubber boats under cover of darkness, approaching to within swimming distance of the shore. They would then swim approximately 3 miles carrying waterproofed reconnaissance equipment, observe and document Japanese defensive positions, plant demolition charges on supply dumps if opportunities presented themselves, and extract before dawn. Standard procedure dictated such operations should involve extensive support, air reconnaissance, and detailed intelligence. The Scouts and Raiders would have none of these advantages. According to war diary entries from the USS transport vessel Gregory, maintained in the National Archives, the weather deteriorated as they approached the target area. Heavy seas and driving rain reduced visibility to virtually zero, conditions that would normally abort a mission. Taylor saw opportunity instead. The Japanese guards would be seeking shelter, their visibility compromised. Their attention focused inward rather than scanning the black waters offshore. The team would insert during the storm. October 11th, 1942, began in darkness so complete that men could not see their hands before their faces. The rubber boats launched from the transport vessel at 200 hours, bouncing across waves that threatened to capsize them with every crest. The men paddled in synchronized silence, even though the storm's fury would have masked considerable noise. Discipline had become instinct during training. At the predetermined distance, they rolled into the water. The ocean temperature shocked even these hardened swimmers cold enough to induce hypothermia within an hour. They wore no wetsuits. Such technology did not yet exist. They relied on constant movement and mental toughness to keep muscles functioning. Each man carried a waterproofed bag containing reconnaissance equipment, weapons, and demolition charges. The weight threatened to drag them under, but they had trained for this, knew how to use the ocean's buoyancy and their own technique to manage the burden. The swim to shore took 90 minutes of constant effort. Twice, Japanese patrol boats passed within hundreds of yards, searchlights sweeping across the water. The men submerged completely, holding their breath for minutes while the boats circled. When the lights moved on, they surfaced and continued swimming. Cold and exhaustion accumulating like debt that would eventually demand payment. They reached the beach at 0 for 15 hours, crawling onto volcanic sand that scraped exposed skin raw.
Ow.
No welcoming committee awaited them. The storm had provided perfect cover. They spread out according to prearranged assignments, moving inland toward their observation positions. The Japanese had fortified the area extensively. Concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces capable of destroying approaching ships dotted the hillsides. Supply depots contained ammunition, fuel, and provisions sufficient to sustain the garrison for months. Machine gun nests commanded every approach to the beaches. For 6 hours, the scouts and raiders observed, documented, and mapped these positions with meticulous precision. Now they sketched the bunkers, estimated troop numbers, identified the locations of ammunition dumps, and noted patterns in patrol schedules. October 11, 1942 continued into daylight hours that transformed the mission from reconnaissance to survival. A petty officer, James Davidson, knew they had been compromised when he heard voices approaching his observation post behind a fallen palm tree. The Japanese patrol consisted of 4 soldiers moving carelessly through the jungle, confident in their control of the territory. Davidson had perhaps 10 seconds to decide, remain hidden and risk discovery, or eliminate the threat silently. He chose action. The knife entered the first soldier's kidney region from behind, the blade angled upward to pierce vital organs before the man could cry out. Davidson eased the dying soldier to the ground while simultaneously signaling his partner, Robert Maxwell, who moved like a shadow to intercept the second enemy soldier. The remaining 2 Japanese guards realized too late that death had arrived. Brief, savage violence erupted in the jungle, the wet sounds of blades finding flesh, a muffled grunt, then silence. 4 bodies lay hidden beneath vegetation within 30 seconds. The scouts and raiders had trained for such contingencies. But training never fully prepared a man for the reality of taking life at close quarters. Davidson felt the dead soldier's blood warm on his hands, saw the expression frozen on the man's face, and forced himself to focus. There would be time for reflection later, assuming there was a later. The team's schedule had collapsed. The missing patrol would be noticed within hours, possibly minutes. Japanese forces would begin systematic searches. The scouts and raiders needed to complete their reconnaissance and extract immediately, but the daylight made movement exponentially more dangerous. Lieutenant Taylor made the decision that defined his leadership. They would split into 3 groups, each taking different routes to the extraction point, maximizing the chances that at least some intelligence would reach American forces. Taylor's group of 7 men encountered the first major problem 40 minutes later. A Japanese supply convoy blocked their route, trucks delivering ammunition and provisions to forward positions. Avoiding the convoy meant detouring through an area where enemy patrols were concentrated. Taylor consulted briefly with his senior petty officer and made a decision that violated every principle of their reconnaissance mission. They would attack the convoy. The logic was sound but ruthless. The enemy was already alerted. Stealth had become secondary to completing objectives and surviving. Destroying this supply convoy would delay Japanese defensive preparations and create chaos that might cover the team's extraction. Scouts and raiders had trained in demolitions specifically for such opportunities. They moved into position with practiced efficiency. 3 men with rifles would provide covering fire from elevated positions. 4 men would rush the convoy simultaneously from different angles, place demolition charges, and withdraw before detonation. The attack began at 13:30 hours local time, as documented in Taylor's after-action report preserved in Naval Special Warfare Command archives. The first shots dropped to Japanese guards before they understood they were under attack. The demolition team sprinted toward the trucks while covering fire forced enemy soldiers to seek protection rather than return accurate fire. Composition charges slapped against fuel drums and ammunition crates, timers set for 60 seconds. The scouts and raiders withdrew in organized chaos, sprinting for the tree line as confused Japanese soldiers tried to identify their attackers. The explosions came precisely on schedule, a chain reaction of secondary detonations as ammunition cooked off and fuel ignited. The blast wave knocked men flat 200 yards away. A mushroom of fire and black smoke climbed into the tropical sky, visible for miles. Taylor watched from the jungle and felt grim satisfaction. Every Japanese unit in the area would converge on this location, but the Americans would not be here. They would be moving toward the extraction point, using the confusion as cover. The second group, led by Chief Petty Officer William Clark, faced different challenges. They had successfully mapped the northern defensive positions when they encountered Japanese forces. Executing what appeared to be a training exercise, approximately 60 soldiers practicing assault tactics on a mock beach position. Clark's 8-man team was outnumbered 7-1, but the enemy had no idea American forces were present. October 12, 1942 arrived with dawn breaking over water that looked deceptively peaceful. And the 3rd Scouts and Raiders group had not reached the extraction point. Lieutenant Taylor waited in a concealed position among the mangroves, scanning the jungle with binoculars while enemy search parties combed the area with increasing intensity. The explosion from yesterday's supply convoy attack had triggered exactly the response he had anticipated. Massive Japanese deployment to locate and destroy the infiltrators. The predetermined extraction window would close in 2 hours. After that, the submarine USS Nautilus would withdraw to avoid detection, leaving anyone still ashore to improvise their own escape or face capture. Taylor had accounted for casualties in his planning, but the reality of potentially abandoning 8 men twisted something in his gut. These were his people, men he had trained beside, men who had trusted his leadership into this nightmare. Chief Petty Officer Clark's group had spent the night evading Japanese patrols through terrain that seemed designed to kill silently. The jungle was a living entity that cut flesh with thorny vines, concealed venomous snakes in every shadow, and amplified the smallest sound into catastrophic noise. They had covered less than 2 miles in 6 hours, moving with agonizing caution as enemy soldiers passed within arm's reach multiple times. Clark's reconnaissance intelligence was potentially war-changing. His team had discovered that the Japanese were constructing a hidden airfield in a valley 3 miles inland, a position from which enemy aircraft could intercept American supply routes and bombing runs. The airfield was nearly complete, with revetments for approximately 40 aircraft already prepared. If this intelligence did not reach American commanders, the strategic situation in the Solomon Islands could deteriorate catastrophically. The group's radio man, Petty Officer Samuel Torres, had been wounded during a brief contact with an enemy patrolla. Bullet had grazed his thigh. Not life-threatening, but enough to slow their movement significantly. Torres insisted he could continue, fashioning a crude bandage from his shirt and using a tree branch as a walking stick. Clark made the brutal calculation that commanders faced throughout history. The mission outweighed individual welfare. They would move as quickly as Torres could manage, but they would not stop. As documented in declassified Pacific Fleet intelligence summaries from this period, the information these small reconnaissance teams provided would reshape American naval strategy for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Traditional intelligence relied on aerial reconnaissance, which showed Japanese positions but could not reveal the depth of fortifications or identify camouflaged installations. The scouts and raiders provided ground truth/actual observation of enemy capabilities, troop strengths, and hidden installations that would have remained invisible until American forces encountered them during costly amphibious assaults. October 12, 1942 at 0600 hours. Clark's group spotted the coastline through breaks in the jungle canopy. The extraction point lay half a mile north, and dawn had fully arrived, eliminating the darkness that would have protected their movement. Japanese search parties had established a perimeter around the likely escape routes. Soldiers positioned every 100 yards, scanning the jungle with weapons ready. Clark gathered his men in a tight circle, speaking in whispers, barely audible above the morning sounds of tropical birds and insects. The situation offered no good options. They could wait for nightfall. But Torres's wound had begun showing signs of infection. The tropical heat and bacteria-rich environment turned minor injuries into life-threatening conditions within hours. It could attempt to break through the Japanese perimeter, but 8 exhausted men against alert enemies held minimal chances of success. Or they could create a diversion so spectacular that the enemy would abandon the perimeter to respond. They chose fire and fury. The group had retained several demolition charges after their reconnaissance mission. Clark proposed using these charges to simulate a major attack from inland, drawing the Japanese forces away from the coastal perimeter while the scouts and raiders sprinted for the extraction point. It was desperate, theatrical, and precisely the kind of unconventional thinking their training had emphasized. Petty Officer John Martinez, the team's demolitions expert, rigged the charges with timers staggered over a 10-minute sequence. The explosions would progress from inland toward the coast, suggesting an attacking force moving toward Japanese positions. Martinez added personal touches. He attached grenades to the charges with tripwires, creating secondary explosions that would mimic weapons fire. He positioned the charges near fuel drums and ammunition boxes they had identified during reconnaissance, maximizing the chaos. October 12, 1942, at 0-7-30 hours. The first explosion tore through the jungle canopy with a sound like God's anger. And Japanese soldiers along the coastal perimeter immediately turned inland, toward the threat. Lieutenant Clark watched through field glasses as the enemy forces reacted exactly as predicted: soldiers abandoning their positions, officers shouting orders, units forming up to repel what appeared to be a major attack from an unexpected direction. The second explosion followed 90 seconds later, 500 yards closer to the coast. Then the third, creating a pattern that suggested advancing forces. Japanese machine gun positions opened fire at shadows and vegetation, their tracers cutting brilliant lines through the morning air. The confusion multiplied as secondary explosions from ammunition stores added genuine chaos to the theatrical performance Martinez had orchestrated. Clark's team moved during the crescendo of destruction. 8 men burst from the jungle onto the narrow beach in full sprint, no longer concerned with stealth because stealth had become impossible. The extraction point lay 600 yards north along the coastline. Behind them, the jungle burned and exploded. Before them stretched open beach, offering zero cover and perfect lines of sight for any enemy soldiers who might still be watching. Torres ran despite his wounded leg, adrenaline temporarily overwhelming pain and fatigue. The others paced themselves to his speed, refusing to leave him behind, even though their training emphasized that the mission outweighed individual survival. Some principles from traditional military service had survived the brutal selection process: the belief that you never abandon your brothers in arms. Japanese observers spotted them after 400 yards. Rifle fire cracked from positions the scouts and raiders had thought were abandoned. Bullets kicked up sand around their boots, too close, the distinctive snap of rounds passing inches from flesh. The men serpentined as they ran, presenting more difficult targets, but they could not stop or seek cover. Stopping meant death. Forward momentum was survival. Clark triggered a smoke grenade as they ran, the purple smoke marking their position for the submarine offshore. The USS Nautilus would be watching through periscope, crew at battle stations. Torpedo tubes loaded in case Japanese patrol boats appeared. Submarines were desperately vulnerable in shallow coastal waters. A single enemy aircraft or patrol boat could force the Nautilus to dive and abandon the extraction. The water appeared ahead, gray-blue, in the morning light. 200 yards? 100? The Japanese rifle fire intensified as enemy soldiers realized their quarry was escaping. A round punched through Petty Officer Marcus Washington's pack, destroying the camera containing reconnaissance photographs but missing flesh by centimeters. Another round grazed Clark's shoulder, drawing blood but not impeding movement. They hit the water still running, diving into waves that offered concealment and salvation. The ocean temperature shocked their overheated bodies, but they were swimmers of exceptional caliber, men who had trained in conditions worse than this. They stroked toward the position where the submarine should be waiting, knowing they had perhaps 5 minutes before Japanese patrol boats arrived to rake the water with machine gun fire. The periscope broke the surface 75 yards offshore. Clark navigated toward it with powerful strokes, his team following in a tight formation that minimized separation. Behind them, enemy soldiers had reached the beach, firing into the water with increasing desperation. The bullets lost velocity quickly in the water, but a lucky shot could still kill. The submarine surfaced partially, deck awash with waves, the forward hatch cracking open. Sailors emerged to help pull the exhausted scouts and raiders aboard, arms reaching down to grasp hands slippery with seawater and blood. Torres came aboard first, despite his protests, then Washington, then the others, in rapid succession. Clark went last, the officer's prerogative, waiting until his entire team had reached safety before accepting the hands that pulled him toward the hatch. Japanese machine gun fire raked the submarine's conning tower as the last man disappeared below. The hatch sealed with a metallic clang that sounded like a bank vault closing. The diving alarm sounded immediately, and the Nautilus slipped beneath the surface as enemy rounds pinged harmlessly off her hull. Inside, 8 men collapsed on the deck plates, gasping for air, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Alive when they should have been dead. October 15th, 1942, found Admiral Chester Nimitz standing before a wall-sized map of the Pacific Theater at Pearl Harbor. Headquarters and the intelligence report from the Scouts and Raiders mission lay on his desk, like a gift from the gods of war. The reconnaissance photographs, hand-drawn maps, and detailed observations provided information that aerial reconnaissance had completely missed. The hidden Japanese airfield, the artillery positions, the supply routes, the troop concentrations all documented with precision that suggested boots on the ground and eyes on target. Nimitz had built his reputation on careful planning and thorough intelligence. He refused to commit forces without understanding the battlefield, an approach that had served him well, but sometimes frustrated subordinates who wanted aggressive action. The Scouts and Raiders had provided exactly what he needed: ground truth that transformed abstract intelligence into actionable plans. The Admiral convened his planning staff for an emergency session. The officers who gathered represented the finest military minds in the Pacific Fleetmen who had survived the disaster at Pearl Harbor and learned hard lessons about underestimating the enemy. They studied the reconnaissance materials with the intensity of scholars examining ancient texts, recognizing immediately the value of what 23 unconventional warriors had accomplished. The Japanese airfield represented the highest priority threat. Enemy aircraft operating from that position could interdict supply lines to Guadalcanal, turning the Marines' precarious foothold into an unsustainable position. Traditional planning would have required weeks of preparation for an airstrike against the airfield. Nimitz gave his planners 72 hours. According to military communication logs preserved in the Naval War College archives, the planning sessions continued around the clock. Navy dive bomber squadrons would attack the airfield at dawn, using the exact coordinates and defensive position information provided by Clark's team.
Simultaneously,
Marine raiders would assault the coastal artillery positions that Taylor's group had mapped. Cruisers would bombard supply depots whose locations had been precisely identified. The operation would strike multiple targets simultaneously, overwhelming Japanese defenses through coordination and surprise. But Nimitz also recognized something more profound than the immediate tactical value. The Scouts and Raiders had proven a concept. Small teams of specially trained warriors could accomplish missions that conventional forces could not. They operated with initiative and flexibility that standard military doctrine discouraged, adapted to circumstances rather than following rigid plans. They were, in essence, a new breed of warrior suited to the kind of warfare the Pacific Theater demanded. The Admiral called for Lieutenant Commander Phil Bucklew, the officer who had proposed the Scouts and Raiders program. Bucklew arrived expecting commendation for the successful mission. Instead, Nimitz handed him an expanded mandate: develop additional unconventional warfare units, recruit and train more men, establish permanent training facilities, and integrate these specialized teams into fleet operations throughout the Pacific. October 19th, 1942, marked the beginning of rapid expansion. Recruitment orders went out to every Navy base in the Pacific and continental United States. Criteria remained similar to the original selection: exceptional physical conditioning, swimming ability, intelligence. and that indefinable quality of mental toughness that separated those who would quit from those who would die before giving up. The response overwhelmed expectations. Thousands of sailors volunteered for prolonged, dangerous, and special duty. Most would be rejected after preliminary screening. The physical standards alone eliminated 90% of applicants, the ability to swim 2 miles in open water, while carrying equipment was not common among sailors who typically worked aboard ships rather than in the water. Training facilities expanded beyond Little Creek. A base was established at Fort Pierce, Florida, where the ocean conditions and coastal terrain resembled the Pacific Islands where these units would operate. The curriculum evolved based on lessons from the Guadalcanal mission. Demolitions training intensified after Clark's team demonstrated the value of creating tactical chaos with well-placed explosives. Combat medicine received increased emphasis after Torres's wound nearly compromised the extraction. Navigation skills were honed to even higher standards after teams reported that jungle terrain made traditional map reading nearly impossible. The program acquired an official designation, Naval Combat Demolition Units, though the men would continue to be called scouts and raiders in operational contexts. The mission profile expanded to include not just reconnaissance, but also direct action sabotage, prisoner snatches, targeting enemy leadership, disrupting supply lines, and generally creating havoc behind enemy lines. November 8, 1942 witnessed the second major Scouts and Raiders deployment, this time involving 3 teams totaling 64 men inserted along the coast of New Georgia Island, where Japanese forces were constructing a major naval base. The lessons from the Guadalcanal mission had been absorbed and integrated into operational planning. This time, the teams had detailed aerial reconnaissance, better equipment, and established extraction protocols, including backup plans for the backup plans. Lieutenant Jack Taylor commanded the overall operation from the USS Nautilus, but each team operated independently once inserted. The Navy was learning that these unconventional units functioned best when given clear objectives and complete freedom to accomplish them using whatever methods the situation required. Micromanagement from headquarters destroyed the initiative and adaptability that made these warriors effective. Team Alpha, led by Chief Petty Officer Robert Maxwell, drew the most dangerous assignment: penetrate the harbor area and assess Japanese ship movements. Identify fuel storage facilities and plant demolition charges on supply vessels if opportunities presented themselves. The mission required swimming through a harbor patrolled by enemy boats, avoiding searchlights and sonar detection, working underwater in darkness, and extracting before dawn. Standard operational doctrine would classify such a mission as suicidal. Maxwell's team volunteered without hesitation. They inserted 2 miles offshore at midnight, swimming through water that glowed with bioluminescent plankton that made stealth nearly impossible. Every stroke created trails of ghostly green light. Maxwell made a command decision. They would swim deeper, where the bioluminescence was less intense, even though it meant holding their breath for extended periods. The team descended to 20 feet and continued toward the harbor, surfacing briefly to breathe and check navigation before diving again. The harbor area was brilliantly illuminated. The Japanese had installed searchlights on patrol boats and shore installations, creating a web of light that swept constantly across the water. Maxwell's team approached underwater, navigating by the sound of ship engines and propellers. They identified their primary target through sound, a large transport vessel, likely carrying supplies or reinforcements, its engines idling as cargo was loaded. Petty Officer David Chen, the team's demolitions expert, carried limpet mines with magnetic attachments and timer detonators. These British-designed weapons had proven effective in European waters. This would be their first use in the Pacific. Chen swam beneath the transport's hull, feeling along the metal plates for the keel structure where a properly placed charge would break the ship's back when detonated. His fingers worked in absolute darkness 20 feet underwater, relying entirely on touch and training to attach the mine correctly. The procedure required 3 minutes per mine. Chen placed 4 charges spaced along the ship's length, setting timers for 6 hours, long enough for the team to extract, but before Japanese engineers could discover and remove the charges. He surfaced behind the ship's stern, gave Maxwell a thumbs-up signal barely visible in the darkness, and the team swam toward the secondary target, a fuel barge moored at the dock. According to Maxwell's after-action report, currently held in restricted Naval Special Warfare archives, the fuel barge demolition nearly ended in disaster. As Chen approached to attach charges, a Japanese guard on the dock above dropped a cigarette into the water, the glowing ember falling within 3 feet of Chen's position. The guard peered into the water, perhaps seeing movement or simply watching the cigarette extinguish. Chen remained absolutely motionless, face submerged, holding his breath as the guard's flashlight beam played across the water's surface. The moment stretched to eternity. Maxwell and the others waited 15 yards away, weapons drawn. Knowing that if Chen was discovered, they would need to fight their way out of a harbor surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers, the guard finally turned away, and Chen resumed his work with hands that trembled, not from fear but from the adrenaline still flooding his system. The charges were placed. The team withdrew with the same careful silence that had brought them into the harbor. They swam for 90 minutes to reach the extraction point where the Nautilus waited at periscope depth. The submarine's crew pulled them aboard 20 minutes before the first charges detonated. February 3, 1943 marked a pivotal moment when Admiral Nimitz authorized the formation of underwater demolition teams, expanding the Scouts and Raiders concept into a comprehensive program that would eventually involve thousands of specially trained warriors. The success rate of reconnaissance and direct action missions had convinced even the most skeptical traditional officers that unconventional warfare units represented force multiplication beyond their numbers. The war in the Pacific had evolved into a pattern. American forces would assault fortified Japanese positions on islands that became synonymous with sacrifice and valor. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each name represented thousands of casualties and lessons purchased with blood. The underwater demolition teams, increasingly known simply as UDT, provided the reconnaissance, beach clearing operations that reduced casualties and increased the chances of successful amphibious assaults. Training intensified to match the expanded mission requirements. The program at Fort Pierce, Florida, developed a reputation that made the original Scout and Raiders training seem gentle by comparison. The instructors, many of them veterans of Pacific operations, understood that the harder they pushed men in training, the more lives would be saved in actual combat. They created what would later be formally designated Hell Week, 5.5 days of continuous physical activity with perhaps 4 hours total sleep, deliberately designed to identify those with the mental toughness to continue functioning when their bodies demanded collapse. Petty Officer James Davidson, the Scout and Raider who had killed his first enemy soldier during the Guadalcanal mission, became one of the primary training instructors. His philosophy emphasized that physical strength mattered less than mental resilience. A man's muscles would eventually fail, but his mind could push beyond failure if properly trained. Davidson became famous for the speech he delivered to each new training class. You will quit only when you decide to quit. Pain is temporary. Quitting is permanent. The enemy will not care that you are tired or cold or hurting. The enemy wants you dead. We will make you harder than anything the enemy can throw at you. The training casualties were significant, but not fatal. Men broke bones, tore ligaments, developed hypothermia, and experienced complete physical breakdowns. Approximately 75% of those who began UDT training failed to complete it. Those who succeeded emerged as warriors with confidence bordering on arrogance, justified by the knowledge that they had survived training that most men could not complete. By mid-1943, UDT teams were operating throughout the Pacific theater. They conducted pre-invasion reconnaissance at virtually every major amphibious landing. They swam into beaches under cover of darkness, measuring water depths, identifying obstacles and mines, mapping defensive positions. They cleared beach obstacles using demolitions, often working in daylight while under direct enemy fire. They rescued downed pilots, conducted raids on enemy installations, and occasionally inserted intelligence operatives behind enemy lines. The casualty rates were substantial, but lower than conventional units. The UDT team's specialized training and operational flexibility allowed them to avoid situations where conventional forces would be forced to fight through. Superior enemy numbers and cornered UDT operators could disappear into the ocean, swimming for miles to reach extraction points or friendly territory. The Japanese learned to fear the mysterious warriors who emerged from the sea, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. One particular mission gained legendary status within the UDT community. A team led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Fraser inserted onto Kwailine Atoll 36 hours before the scheduled marine assault. Their reconnaissance revealed that the Japanese had installed underwater obstacles designed to rip the bottoms from landing craft steel rails driven into the coral reef with edges sharpened to pierce holes. Traditional planning would have accepted heavy landing craft losses during the assault. Fraser's team spent an entire night underwater, using hacksaws and bolt cutters to remove the obstacles. They worked in water shallow enough that waves occasionally broke over their heads. Within rifle range of Japanese beach defenses, clearing lanes through which marine landing craft could safely approach. When the assault began, Marines encountered minimal obstacles and reached the beach with far fewer casualties than anticipated. August 15, 1945, arrived with Japan's surrender announcement crackling through radio speakers worldwide, and the underwater demolition teams had compiled a combat record that military historians would study for generations. They had participated in every major Pacific campaign, conducted hundreds of reconnaissance and direct action missions, and established doctrines for unconventional maritime warfare that would influence military planning for decades. Lieutenant Commander Phil Buchlu, whose vision had initiated the program, stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay during the formal surrender ceremony. He watched representatives of the Japanese Empire sign the documents ending the most destructive conflict in human history. And he thought about the 40 criminals who had volunteered for prolonged, dangerous, and special duty 3 years earlier. 23 had survived the initial training. Of those, 17 were still alive. The Pacific had claimed 6, their bodies resting beneath waters they had once swum with seemingly superhuman skill. The immediate question facing military planners was whether these unconventional units had a place in peacetime. Traditional military thinking suggested that specialized wartime formations should be disbanded once the fighting ended. Budgets would shrink, personnel would demobilize, and the regular Navy would return to pre-war standards. Some senior officers argued that UDT represented an expensive luxury, affordable only during total war. Admiral Nimitz fought to preserve the program. He submitted detailed analyses demonstrating that unconventional warfare capabilities provided strategic advantages disproportionate to their cost. In an increasingly complex world where conflicts might not involve conventional battles between massed armies, small teams of highly trained specialists could accomplish objectives that would otherwise require major military operations. His arguments prevailed, though the program was significantly reduced from its wartime peak. The designation changed in the post-war years. UDT remained the official name, but the missions evolved to include Cold War requirements, intelligence gathering, infiltration operations, counterinsurgency support. When the Korean War began in 1950, UDT teams deployed immediately, conducting reconnaissance and demolition operations similar to their Pacific campaigns, but adapted to different terrain and different enemies. May 25, 1961, represented the date when these lineages formally converged into something new. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, himself a Navy veteran who understood maritime operations, authorized the creation of sea, air, and land Team SEAL teams. The designation emphasized that these warriors would operate in all environments, though their core competencies remained rooted in maritime operations that traced directly back to the scouts and raiders of World War II. According to official Navy Special Warfare Command histories, the first SEAL teams drew their initial personnel from UDT veterans, men who carried forward the traditions established 2 decades earlier. The training evolved, incorporating lessons from Korea and early Vietnam operations. But the fundamental philosophy remained identical. Select exceptional individuals, break them through impossibly difficult training, rebuild them as warriors capable of operating independently in hostile territory, and trust them to accomplish missions that conventional forces could not. The original 40 criminals who reported for Scout and Raiders training in 1942 would barely recognize their modern descendants. Contemporary SEAL operators employ technology that would seem like science fiction to World War II veterans' night vision devices. Satellite communications, precision weapons, insertion methods ranging from high-altitude parachute jumps to submarine lockout procedures. But the core characteristics remain unchanged: mental toughness, physical conditioning, swimming ability, independence of thought, and absolute commitment to completing the mission regardless of personal cost. The numbers tell part of the story. from 40 recruits in 1942 to over 30,000 men who have earned the SEAL Trident since the program's inception. The tradition speaks louder. The Naval Special Warfare community maintains museums and memorials honoring those original Scouts and Raiders, recognizing that modern capabilities rest on foundations built by men who swam into hostile harbors, armed with knives and demolition charges, conducted reconnaissance missions that should have been suicide operations, who established that small numbers of superbly trained warriors could accomplish what conventional forces could not. Lieutenant Jack Taylor, who commanded the first operational Scout and Raiders mission at Guadalcanal, lived to age 96, long enough to see SEAL teams operate in Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Before his death in 2007, he attended a SEAL team graduation ceremony and watched new warriors receive their tridents. A reporter asked if he saw continuity between his generation and these modern operators. Taylor smiled and replied, "Same spirit, better equipment. We proved that courage and training could overcome impossible odds. They carry that legacy forward. The enemy changes, the technology changes, but the warrior spirit remains constant." The 40 criminals sent to fight 30,000 Japanese created more than tactical victories. They established that the human will, properly trained and tested, could achieve what conventional wisdom declared impossible. They proved that innovation and courage could force multiply small numbers into strategic impact. They built the foundation upon which the most elite fighting force in American military history would rise. Their legacy is written in every SEAL who enters the water, every mission accomplished against overwhelming odds, every enemy who learns to fear the silent warriors emerging from the sea. The experiment begun in desperation during America's darkest hours became a permanent institution, a testament to the vision of leaders willing to try unconventional solutions and the courage of warriors, willing to volunteer for missions that offered slim chances of survival. From 40 volunteers to thousands of warriors, from improvised training to the most sophisticated special operations program in the world, the line remains unbroken, a legacy forged in the Pacific, tempered by decades of conflict, and carried forward by each new generation who earns the right to call themselves Naval Special Warfare Operators.